good afternoon, everybody. Sego, Bojo, Oni, Tansei. I'm Trevor Phillips. I'm a staff member at Indigenous Services, and we have partnered with a number of other people to bring this talk together for you. Standing a little close to the mic here. I would just like to welcome you all to the last talk this afternoon. The Honourable James Bartleman is here to talk about the current contemporary Indigenous experience. And I'll be emceeing things a little bit, as well as introducing Honourable James Bartleman. So I'd like to bring up Candice Burnett, the Director of Indigenous Services, to do a formal gesture of greeting. Candice.
Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon on this beautiful fall day. My name is Candice Burnett, and I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the territory that we are located in here in London, Ontario, southwestern Ontario. Historically, the Adirondran, or the neutral people, once settled this region alongside the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe or Algonquin people. Today, London, Ontario is home to a diverse Indigenous population, as well as other newcomers to this country. And just outside of London, not very far at all, about 15 to 20 minutes, are three vibrant First Nations communities. They are the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, the Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Lenape, the Munsee Delaware Nation. And I felt that it was appropriate to begin this talk this evening with an acknowledgement of the territory and the land and place that we call home. Next, I'd like to hand it over to Trevor to just give us a little bit of background about our guest this evening. I'm very honored to be part of bringing the Honourable Lieutenant Governor, former Lieutenant Governor, James Bartleman to be part of this Words Festival. This is very exciting for Indigenous Services to be part of, so I'll hand it back over to Trevor. Thank you.
Thank you, Candice. Again, I'm Trevor Phillips. I work for Indigenous Services in Youth Outreach and Program Coordinating. I also work with graduate students, and I do a little bit of writing tutoring there. I'm currently doing my PhD in Indigenous Literature at Queen's, so that's the kind of crossover we got going on. I'm originally from Central Alberta. I grew up just outside of Edmonton, West Edmonton, a little Métis community called Calahoo, for all of you who might be familiar of it. So it's a long way from home for me. Not so far away from home for our speaker today, who is from the Chippewas of the Rama First Nation, the Ojibwe territory near Orillia in Lake Couchiching. I had the privilege of spending some time in Lake Couchiching this winter, Mr. Bartleman, and it was beautiful to be there on the doorstep of the body of water and watch the wind blow over and cover the town across the way. And it was very inspiring, and I wrote a story about a badger and a bear having dinner together. But it's not about my writing, it's about Mr. Bartleman's writing today. Absolutely, the 27th Lieutenant Governor of Ontario and the Vice-Regal Representative. The political diplomatic career for our speaker today is long, and it is prestigious. When I tore out a piece of paper to write it down, I quickly ran out of room to catch it all. But a couple of the key highlights to acknowledge in his work as an ambassador for the nation of Canada. Ambassador to Cuba, obviously in the early 80s, Director of Security and Intelligence, High Commissioner to Cyprus and the Ambassador to Israel, did ambassador work with NATO in the early 90s, Commissioner to South Africa and Australia, and a lot of this work informing some of the nonfiction work he wrote and his memoirs when he was in office as the Lieutenant Governor. As part of his mandate in his term as Lieutenant Governor from 2002 and 2007, he had three main goals. The first one was to reduce the stigma of mental illness. The second one was to fight racism and discrimination. And the third, and the one I'm most proud of that you did, was promote literacy among First Nations children. As an Indigenous scholar working on Indigenous literature, I've come into contact with your work in the community in that regard, predominantly in Northern Ontario, where you set up the Lieutenant Governor's book drive and managed to bring in over $1.2 million, or 1.2 million books in donations to the Northern Ontario communities for Indigenous children to read. The Twinning program, which brought into contact First Nations communities and non-First Nations people to inspire literacy amongst youth. The summer literacy camps that go on all over the Northern Ontario region, and the Club Amick Book Club. Is it Amick? We say Amick out west, or do you say it differently? Amick, okay, because that's beaver, right? Yeah, we say Amick where I'm from. My dad's actually named Amick. Some of the part of the bibliography that we have, as I mentioned, the nonfiction writing that he did previous to now the new turn towards young adult fiction. And As Long as the River Flows, which was published in 2011, and was a finalist for the prestigious Burt Award for First Nations, Métis, Inuit literature. Also on that panel of finalists, Richard Wagamiese's Indian Horse, which is a very popular book that took Canada by storm. So in elite company there in terms of contemporary Indigenous authors. And a more recent book, The Redemption of Oscar Wolfe, a picaresque novel that was described in the London Free Press recently as an absorbing, I got really excited there, an absorbing and enchanted journey with crisp commentary on the reality of unintended consequences. So that sounds fascinating, and I'm sure we'll speak to consequence and some of the other themes that come out in that book today. The talk that you're here to hear is the Aboriginal Canadian as outsider, and I'm very pleased to welcome to the front of the room the Honourable James Bartleman to speak.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I have a connection with London in that I did my grade 13 at London Central Collegiate back in 1958-59, and then I went to Western for 4 years, and so I have that connection, and it's been a pleasure to come back over the years. So the title sounds very academic, The Aboriginal Canadian as Outsider. I've written 3 novels, As Long as the Rivers Flow, The Redemption of Oscar Wolfe, and Exceptional Circumstances. And in all 3 of them, Native people are portrayed in one way or another as the outsider in society. In the As Long as the Rivers Flow, I wrote it from the point of view of a Native woman. In my travels in Northern Ontario, and the Government of Ontario puts at the disposal of the Lieutenant Governor a twin-engined King aircraft, and Lieutenant Governors make community visits. So I use that to get to travel into all the remote communities of Northern Ontario, because otherwise it wouldn't have been possible. There are no year-round roads to 26 of the communities. There's only ice roads in the winter, and you have to be pretty, not brave, but they're really rough rides into the communities. So I went into the communities and discovered that the situation of the children was terrible, that there was a suicide epidemic had been going on for years. I first of all flew into Saskatchewan, which is right across the river from Fort Albany. When the plane was circling to land, there was a plane taking off, a great crowd of people at the airport. And so after we landed, I asked the chief what was going on. And he said that a 13-year-old girl had killed herself by melting Tylenol 3 and injecting herself with it until she died. She wanted to die. And they were flying her out to Timmins for an autopsy. And I said, why did she do it? And he said, and he looked at me as if I was very naive. She said, well, she had no hope. Not too long afterwards, I got a call from Grand Chief Stan Beardy of the Anishinaabe Nation. He was the Grand Chief for the 49 communities in this political grouping. 49 First Nations occupying about 2/3 of the landmass of Ontario. And he said that 3 kids at Winnemucca Lake First Nation had killed themselves. And they were part of a suicide pact. They were the kids in the combined grades 7 and 8. The community was in a state of shock. And he wanted me to come up just to show the community that the rest of the province cared. He said, nobody cares. And so I picked Stan up, and we flew into Wunnamun Lake. And the kids at the school, I went to see the kids, and the kids in the combined, those who were left in the combined grade 7 and 8 class, and there were only about a dozen or more of them there at that time, they all looked to be in a terminal state of depression. No one would lift their head. They had the hoodies over their heads, and they just looked down, absolutely silence in the room. And I could tell that a lot of them wanted to do the same thing, kill themselves. And when I asked the families what had happened, they said that they knew that something was wrong, but they didn't know what. Because what is very common up in those communities is that when there is a suicide pact among the kids, the first one dies, and then the others are visited. And they don't say in their dreams, but probably in their dreams, because it's a very real thing for the members of the community. They're visited by the person who killed herself, and the person says, "It's your turn. Nobody has ever kept their word with us. Now you have given your word and you have to die." And the second one dies. And then those two spirits visit the third. And when they start hearing about the visitation of the dead, people are very worried. And that's a fairly common thing up there. So a very heart-rending situation. And then I visited the Mnjikaning First Nation, which is just south of Pickle Lake. This is the community that Archbishop Desmond Tutu visited. I had lunch with Archbishop Tutu when I was Lieutenant Governor in Toronto. And I also had met him in South Africa when I was Canada's High Commissioner there. And I told him, what I was doing, my priorities and all the rest. And he said that in 1990, I guess it was, he came to Canada to thank Mr. Mulrooney and the Conservatives for leading the fight internationally against apartheid, for standing up to Margaret Thatcher and Reagan and others, and promoting societies free of racial discrimination and equality. And he was glad to do that. And as a matter of fact, I came back with Mandela later when I was High Commissioner in South Africa. And he wanted to come back to come and thank Canada for what they had done to fight apartheid. But Archbishop Tutu said that he was invited by the chief of Mnjikaning to go visit. And he went up to Mnjikaning. And he said it was worse than anything in the black townships, that he couldn't understand how internationally we would be promoting and standing up for human rights and fair treatment, fight against discrimination, when we tolerated such a situation as existed in Mnjikaning. When I went into the community, I was brought in by the RCMP, the OPP. What I saw going in were fresh graves, lots of fresh graves, and they were on the graves. There were fishing equipment, there were dolls, there were baseball hats. And the chief told me that they had in the past decade, something like 200 violent deaths in that community, out of a population of about 1,500. Not all by suicide, but a lot by suicide. He said people hated themselves. People wanted to die, the kids in particular. And I went by houses, brand new houses that had been built, and the windows had been smashed out and all the furniture thrown out on the snow. The kids, he said that's because the kids hate themselves and they want to self-destruct and will destroy anything. But suicide was among the kids was prevalent. And so I thought back to when I was a kid and what had been the major factor which we talked last night, for those of you who are here, about luck. Anybody here heard us talk about luck? Yeah. I'd been lucky, but it hadn't appeared that way at the beginning. Coming from the bottom of the social economic scale, my parents having about a grade 4 education. My dad always assumed that his 2 boys would grow up to be ditch diggers like he was. But, I did a little ditch digging, but it's most boring, hard, underpaid work. My dad come home, always covered with dirt and mud, and paid, the bottom of the scale. And so I didn't want to be a ditch digger. But what I had going for me was that in that first summer in Port Carling, after we came there right after the war, we lived up by the dump. And my brother and I used to chase the garbage trucks up to the dump. And I had in those days, there were lots of comic books up there. And Port Carling is in the center of a very wealthy area of lots of tourists. And they were throwing out their comic books. And so I took them back to the tent. And my mother helped me make out the words, syllables, in the little bubbles. And when I started school, I was well on my way to being able to read. Then I discovered the library, and that was really my ticket out of that life, because I was able to dream of other worlds. I was able to dream of being something other than a ditch digger. And the other lucky things happened. As I mentioned last night, I was a rich American, decided that he would support my education by giving me the money to come to London, Ontario, and rent an apartment and go to grade 13 and then go to Western. And so you have to think about your own life your own experiences when you're trying to help other people. And I also wanted to try to give back if I could. And I had no budget. I spoke to people in the federal government, and they said, "Oh, yes, I got kisses on both cheeks," and nothing happened. And so, then when I talked to people in the provincial government, they said, "Well, if we start helping, then we're going to be stuck, and the federal government will make us pay for everything." This is a conversation I've had with the current premier a number of times. Because the needs are so great, you would think they would just cut through the red tape and help. And so I decided that I would try to enlist the goodwill of the people of Ontario. There's a lot of racism, but there's also a tremendous amount of goodwill, and people don't know life on Native communities. But they're aware that things are pretty bad up north. And so I decided I would establish libraries, because there were no libraries in those communities. Matter of fact, a lot of the schools were really broken down. And the teachers were doing their best, but you don't have to have a teaching certificate to teach in those communities. It's so hard to get teachers. They give you a letter, you go in. So sometimes you don't get the most mature teachers going into those places. And in many cases, they go into a state of culture shock and leave at the first opportunity. And then they have to bring in another young teacher or someone willing to go into the community. So there's a revolving door, and the literacy levels were terrible. And so I thought, if we establish libraries, the kids at least would be able to have a place to turn to read. And so I sent a press release to the Association of Community newspapers, about 200 of them, small newspapers across the province, and they published it. And the teachers and the librarians all rallied behind. First thing I knew, books were arriving at Queen's Park. And I didn't have any resources for them, so the commissioner of the OPP came to a dinner I gave, and I was sitting beside her, and I said, can you help get these books into the communities and help collect them? And she thought I was talking about a few thousand books. And she said, sure. And so I went on Ontario Today, I went on CBC News, I brought the CBC correspondents with me into the communities. The National came up, and I said, we want good used children's books to bring into the communities, and to take them to the OPP detachment closest to you. And so they were overwhelmed. I had stories at the beginning that one sergeant tried to arrest a person who brought so many books. But we cleared that up, because that became the real priority. And so they filled up they had to park their cars outside, and the garages filled up, but I needed to sort them. So I went to the military and asked them if they would put a Downsview at my disposal. So they put Downsview at my disposal, and Manitoulan Transport from Manitoulan Island collected books and brought them in, and we did 2 book drives, a total of well over 2 million books in 2 drives, which we sorted down to about 1.5 million. And then we had no way of getting them into the communities, which remains a problem to this day. But there's an organization called the Rangers, a native organization called a military organization, and they go in on the winter roads, and they brought in many tractor-trailer loads into the communities. And the military parachuted books in. And I was so proud of that. I got Global, the National, CTV, Woodall. We all went up to Fort Severn, and it was about 40 below. The snow was up to our necks, and we were there to record and let the people of Ontario know that all measures were being taken to deal with the problems of illiteracy and to give children things to read. So we heard this big C-130 transport coming up the river, the Severn River. I thought it was like a thunderbird of old, roar, roar, roar. And then it came into view, and the back was down. There's a big lift where trucks and things are located. And then as they got pretty close to us, we're all standing in the river on ice. These huge boxes came tumbling out, and many of them went straight down without the parachutes opening. We had books scattered all over. And the media said, Your Honor, is this the way it's supposed to be? I said, no problem. But everybody went out in their snowmobiles and went home, and were picking books out of the snow and dusting them off. And the next run, which they did at another community, went off perfectly, because they were just practicing, I guess. And then a native airline stepped in, Wasay Airlines, and if they had charged the commercial rate, it would have been over $600,000, but they donated all of that, and they brought the books into the communities. So our libraries were established, and it was really nice to go up and you'd see the kids lining up to borrow books like they do here in London, Ontario. Then I decided that I would establish a book club, and because the chief at a very a community with a lot of problems, Mnjikaning. He said, when I was a little boy, he's a great, big, giant guy. We had a club at school, the teacher organized, called the Bookworm Club. That was so wonderful. I thought, oh, that's a good idea. So I went back and I raised $1.5 million, and which I gave to the Southern Ontario Library Service, and came up with the concept of providing one brand new children's book, good quality, to all children in all the flying communities of Northern Ontario every 3 months, and establish their own magazine. And soon that was up and running, and it's still running to this day. And then I set up summer reading camps. I raised $7 million, and I had pilots, and I chose Frontier College to run with it. And they are now, even though I'm no longer involved directly, it went from 25 communities, all the First Nation flying communities of Ontario, to 86 across Canada last summer. And in many of these communities, it's the only thing that the kids have going. They go in with, they take about 200 university students who are trained, and they take about 1,000 or 2,000 books into each community, and they focus on learning to read in a fun way. And it's really wonderful. And then I established literary prizes for young Aboriginal students in Ontario. But the suicides didn't stop. The problems in the community are so deep-rooted that ways have to be, only governments really can intervene. And what governments have to do, first of all, is to provide the same level of funding and services to Native people as to non-Native people in terms of educational funding and child welfare funding and all the rest of it. But they don't do it. And it's a national shame. The United Nations has drawn attention to it. And they don't do it because they know they wouldn't get any political credit for it, because the population as a whole, it's good to give books, but in terms of getting excited about the suicide of Native kids in the North, people have problems of their own. They really, not that they don't care, it's just that the people up there are invisible to them. And so when I finished my term as Lieutenant Governor, and I was no longer able to raise funds and all the rest of it, I was able to encourage the programs that I started and continue, especially with Frontier College, to be active. I decided to focus on trying to make in a modest way, members of the Canadian public aware of Native condition as seen from the inside. So my first book was As Long as the Rivers Flow. And in it, the protagonist, Martha, goes to the St. Anne's School in Fort Albany, and I describe, as these ladies who told me their stories described to me, how they were taken from their communities on float planes, and if the parents didn't let the kids go, the parents could go to jail. And so, because it was the law that they had to be separated from their children. The idea was that you would take the children, put them in a type of reform school environment, almost like jails, little jails, but they didn't look upon them that way. And you would turn them into white people at the end of 10 years. So they went home, so they went to the communities, and they were, and this was started 100 years ago. And so for generation after generation, the Native kids up in those communities were removed from their parents at the age of 6 They would go back for the summers, and every time they went back, they know less and less about their language and culture, until when they did go back, they were outsiders, and that's one of the terms I use in this lecture. They were outsiders in their communities, alienated from their parents. They didn't know how to live on the land like the first generation did. And worse than that, they were rejected in many cases, by their parents, because the parents weren't used to raising them, and they turned to each other. And when they went to, and they felt, when they went out on the winter roads to Thunder Bay, they experienced the racism of society, pretty open in those days, still pretty open in these days, and they felt rejected, outsiders in that. And so then they lost their culture to a great extent, so they had no roots to fall back on. And so when I was going up there, they had started, the suicide epidemic started in 1987, shortly after the last residential school closed and the winter roads to the outside opened up, and there was a relationship there. And the kids began to kill themselves. And so I wanted that story to be told. So I have Martha going to the school at the age of 6, being abused by the priest identified to me by these ladies, returning home at the age of 16, her mother rejecting her, getting pregnant, becoming a heavy drinker, beaten up by her husband leaves, she gets her life together, and she decides to go to the big city, and she finds in the big city that she felt more at home than she did on the reserve. Because on the reserve, because of the fundamentalist missionaries, and I don't have any, no judgment on anybody's religion, but they would not allow the kids to participate in powwows, the big drum, jingle dancing. Didn't like native art. It was all the work of the devil. And they said the first commandment is, thou shalt have no other gods beside me. And so when they went to Toronto, they found that there was a vibrant native community there, that you had dance groups, you had powwows, you had theater. And so she felt more at home there. But eventually she had to return to the reserve, and the book is one of forgiveness and the community coming together at the end. But that is that first book. It has been sent by Canada Council to every First Nation community across Canada. So then I decided to, that was the point of view of a woman. So then I decided to do one on the alienation that Native people felt. You were talking about we're on the home of the people of the Neutrals and the Haudenosaunee, and then now of the Senecas and the Chippewas and the others here. But we say those things, but really, I wonder, in fact, it's the land of the white people here. But the Native people still feel that link, and it's a very emotional link. And where I grew up in Port Carling, there was a Native community, a thriving Native community in Port Carling and Muskoka, with farms, and we grew corn, they had pigs, they trapped, they hunted. But in the late 60s, 1860s, 1870s, the government decided they would open Muskoka up for colonization, and they kicked the Indians out. They just told them to go. And many of them went to Perry Island, some went to Rama. And when I was growing up, I could see a number of their old log cabins, because they turned the log cabins. First of all, the white people had moved into their houses, and then as they built bigger houses, they turned the log cabins into pig pens and stables, and they had plowed up the bones of the people, scattered them, and part of the history of Muskoka which no one paid any attention to. And so, but I was, very conscious of that. And my mother, who passed away just a couple of years ago at the age of 92, would often tell me about what it was like. She was born on Lake Joseph during a fishing trip by her parents. They spent their summers at the Indian camp in Port Carling, which was a small reserve there. And she had gone through and she spent about a month in the spring and a month in the fall at the local white school. And she had a hard time there. She was dressed differently. I have a letter from somebody who met her in the early 30s and said she smelled of sweetgrass, which I think would be a lovely thing to smell of, but also subject to a lot of names. She also told me about a fire which burned down the business section of Port Carling in 1930. And her mother was out walking on the path in the Indian camp, and somebody knocked her over, probably someone from the Indian camp, a native person, and he smelled of coal oil. And shortly thereafter, the bells, because in those days they used church bells. There were 2 bells in every church. One was for calling people to worship on Sundays. The other one was to call them to come and fight fire. So there's a short one. So it was ding, 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 ding. And then she saw the flames, the light of the flames in the town as things burnt. And the men of the Indian camp ran and joined with the white men of the village, and they tried to put it out, but they couldn't stop it. And my grandfather ran into a burning building and pulled out a tourist girl who was working as a maid, but she died. And I thought, I want to turn this into a novel, but the issue of alienation of land and the petty racism that existed in that period and which continues to exist in a more subtle form today. So I wrote The Redemption of Oscar Wolf. In a way, it reminds me of the homegrown jihadists. I'm not saying that in any way you compare frustrated Native youth to jihadists, but Oscar, this young man, he had had his pants pulled down when he was 6 or 7 years of age by some bullies at the Port Carling school. And then they held him and they called out at the group of girls, would you like to see this Redskins, you know what? And they said yes. And so he pulled down his underwear as well. So he ran home just completely humiliated. And he went to see his grandfather. I'm thinking of my own grandfather. But his grandfather said, what you have to do if you're a Native person in Canada is to fit in. The grandson thought his grandfather would go and catch those kids and give them a licking. And if their fathers come, you hit them, because his grandfather had been a war hero and he'd killed lots of Germans, apparently. But his grandfather said, no, you just got to fit in. You just got to take it. But Oscar never accepted that. And when he thought his mother was being abused by a white man, he just lost it. He felt marginalized. He was taken to fight he decided to hit back. I suppose in a sense that, young people who feel marginalized and no outlet will do similar things. And so he burnt down the he was the one in my book who set fire to the village. And in the book I have, instead of the grandfather, like my grandfather, saving someone's life, I have him being burnt to death, together with the girl. And so, this terrible violence as a result of being the outsider in white society in the 1930s in Canada. And so the rest of the book is about how he seeks redemption for this deed. And so he decides that he's going to fit in, because that's what his grandfather had told him to do. But that wasn't easy to do. So that's that book. Then the third one, outsider as well, is about the post-9/11 security climate, security world in which we live. I have a Métis protagonist who is hired by the Department of External Affairs because of positive stereotypes. On the one hand, the Director General of Security Intelligence, that's a job I once had, wanted him in the department because when he was a soldier in the Second World War, he had Métis soldiers, and they were mean SOBs. He wanted mean SOBs. And the other member of the recruiting team wanted him in because he thought of Métis as being noble savages. Everything they did was like Hiawatha, paddling his canoe, dispensing wisdom, being nice. And they thought that if we just have enough sufficient number of Métis and First Nation people in the Department of External Affairs, it will mean that human rights will gradually become more important to the Canadian government. So he is taken in under false pretenses, but he ends up being a hapless spy, and he ends up being a member of the task force dealing with the FLQ crisis in 1970, which is something that I was a member of that task force, and being present at a cabinet meeting in which the government approved something called exceptional circumstances. That's the title of my book. And in exceptional circumstances, which is the truth, the government in 2010 authorized CSIS, the RCMP, the DND, and the Communications Security Establishment to use information derived from torture in their work, which is contrary to all of the international agreements that Canada has ever had with the United Nations. And I was outraged. I wrote a letter to the Globe and Mail saying that the minister had lost his moral compass. He had wrote back saying, no, that we would only use that information in exceptional circumstances. But he didn't define it very well. The exceptional circumstances were threat to property, threat to lives. Well, so I thought I would write a book which would examine those issues. First of all, on the first level, it's a thriller. You can read it and not think about the ethical issues. On the other level, it can be looked at as an examination of several things. For example, blood over rights. When Albert Camus, the great Nobel Prize-winning French author, was receiving his Nobel Prize, he was asked about, because the Algerian War was going on, who do you support in Algeria? You know, your family lives in Algeria. Do you support the Pieds Noirs, the people who want to keep the Algerians under their heel, or do you support the Algerians? And he said, even though he was a great human rights advocate, he said, the criteria is you support your family, first of all. And if your family is violating human rights, you stay with them just the same. So blood, family, comes over rights. And that is one of the things that drives a lot of national liberation wars and terrorist mythology and all the rest. And then I wanted to look at the issue of what is the correct balance between civil liberties and national security in the post 9/11 world. And then, most important of all, I wanted to have the protagonist be on a rendition mission, taking a dual national who was involved in the FLQ as a member of one of the cells, one of the terrorist groups, expelled, like the government wants to do now. They're putting these rules forward, expelled to her country of origin, although she didn't really know it anymore, where they would torture her and send the information back to CSIS to be used. And so I have them on a plane trip discussing these issues. And then I have a long look at what torture does, as I see it in the writings of Malraux and Arthur Koestler and others. And coming to the conclusion that if we support things like the use of torture to get information, although we're very careful that we don't do the torturing ourselves, we send it to somebody else, or we just get the information from somebody else, then what does that mean for the nature of our society? And I picked Meiji because he was an outsider. And that book becomes available next April. It's called Exceptional Circumstances. And I shared it with Amnesty International, and they are supporting it. And I'm giving them all the funds from it. And so that is my presentation on the Aboriginal Canadian as outsider.
Thank you, sir. We'd like to open up the floor now to questions for the Honourable James Bartleman. He'll be happy to take any of your questions, I'm sure. I have a couple percolating in my head here, too, to get us started if we wanted to, but I'd love to open it up to the floor first. Actually, I saw a hand come up right here.
I have two questions. Would you care to comment on the distinction between land as a spirited relative and land as a resource commodity? Two worlds in conflict. And would you also comment perhaps on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission winding up its work in June of next year? What would reconciliation look like for us with a sensitivity for the outsider?
I don't think there's a contradiction between land, your attachment to land, because it's the land of your ancestors, and the use of that land for your own economic benefit of your community. So I think that there is no difference there, but the language today is what the land as, it's the reason they oppose, in some communities, the development of resources is because the land is sacred. They don't want to disturb it. Many other places, they want to be involved in the exploitation of the lumber and the mineral resources. In terms of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think that there will be no reconciliation until Native people receive the same equality in terms of social justice as non-Native people. The Prime Minister made this apology several years ago, but it meant nothing. I was there at the House of Commons, and everyone was so happy because they expected that that was just the first step, that there would be steps taken to give Native people the same level, Native children the same level of funding as non-Native children, etc. But that hasn't happened. And so there will never be reconciliation until there is social economic justice for Native people.
Other question? I wanted to pick up on this idea of apology leading off the first answer to the first question. And thinking about the most recent apology to come out as we've kind of entered into an era of apology and towards misdeeds done to Indigenous communities by the colonial government. I'm curious to see what your thought is. The most recent one being by the government of BC, the provincial legislature, apologizing to the Tsiklotan people for hanging their chiefs in the 19th century. And one of the things that stood out to me from testimony about that apology was by members of the community saying that that story, that event, had stayed with them for years and years and years and has defined their community today. And the importance of that apology as a step in reconciliation. You talk about economic justice or economic equality coming first, but I'm curious, as a writer, where you think the process of reconciliation takes place for Indigenous communities and having their story heard and having that story acknowledged through apology.
I would say words are cheap. You got to have action. Now, in terms of these historic wrongs that people talk about, and you say everyone's apologizing, well, I'm glad they are. But what is interesting today, as we are in the wake of the events on Parliament Hill, is that almost all those great injustices, for example, the rounding up Japanese Canadians and sending them to the work camps, removing their right to vote, what all, occurred as a result of some big national crisis. And in the wake of 9/11 in the United States, that was their national crisis, and they just threw away the law books, and they became involved in active torture in black sites around the world, completely contrary to what their image of themselves. In wake of the FLQ crisis of 1970, the government found it very easy to declare the War Measures Act, which removed habeas corpus and all the rights of citizens of Quebec. They rounded up 500 people, not one of whom was ever charged with anything because they weren't in any way members of the FLQ. When the news of Laporte's death occurred, the guards pulled them out of the prison cells and beat them, but no one made any noise about that. And the population really supported it. And so if we have a major crisis proportionately along the lines of the 9/11 crisis, I have no doubt that we would do something similar in Canada. And I'm very happy to see that this time, in the wake of the crisis on the Hill, that the opposition parties are saying, just wait a minute, we need to look at our security rules, but we have to make sure that the rights and liberties of Canadians are preserved. In other words, don't throw our rights and liberties out because for the sake of national security, because we want to keep our identity and our values. And so that is something which we have to watch.
And I think I can speak for a lot of us in the room where we're watching the current administration's handling of this event, aftermath, cautiously and hoping for measured response, absolutely. Turning to some of your ideas about promoting literacy, which was part of your campaign when you were in the office, I'm curious to get your reading, your take on the current administration's focus on arts, literature, and the humanities, and how that speaks to some of your interests, especially in Indigenous communities.
I can't answer that. I don't know the answer to that.
Too big? Does anybody else? There's a question.
Yes, I wondered whether you would think that the current situation of these very remote communities, and a great number of them isolated in the north, whether that's a structure for anything positive, or whether in fact that whole situation has to be overturned in order to give the community purpose, or the people feel purposeful.
When you say overturn, you mean
Well,
round them up and send them
is
stuff.
there some other social system that would work better, or is there something that can be injected into the community that would give it life and hope?
Well, in terms of system, I think democracy, liberal democracy, is the way to go. Votes, electing their leaders, I think there has to be in terms of the communities that are so troubled in the north, you need many different interventions at the same time. And your approach is like doing development work in the third world. You have to be engaged in community development. You have to provide capacity to the communities by promoting literacy, education, and having people who can run the power plant. They're having people who can be the nurses and others, and those who don't want to stay in the community can go and work and join the mainstream Canadian population, but they have to have that. You have to have, and this is something that in Northern Ontario that a number of the leaders are working on, the whole issue of strengthening families. When I was Lieutenant Governor, I went as a guest to huge tent revival meeting style gatherings where up to 1,000 people from those communities came in, and they brought in speakers who had been in jail, who had abused their families and all the rest of it. They held healing circles, and in my book I describe one of those healing circles where the parents say, I was a bad parent. I should have paid more attention to my daughter before we found her hanging from a coat rack in the closet. It's my fault. When she complained about her grandfather touching her in bad places, we did nothing, we blamed her. So family strengthening is a major thing, and at these gatherings they had family counselors there so the husbands and wives could talk. So that's another major thing that has to be done. Then you need economic development, and so you have to be sure that the Native communities get their fair share of the resources that are being developed in those communities. It has to be a multidisciplinary thing. You can't just deal with education and say that that's going to be the panacea. It has to be education. It also has to be family strengthening. There are over 100,000 Native children in care across Canada, and they receive far less on a per capita basis than white kids in care. You have to have strengthened families so that those kids stay at home. In my Aboriginal literary prizes that I asked to be established when I left, we get about 500 stories and short stories and poems from Métis, First Nation, and Inuit kids in Ontario. And one of the themes is alienation, unhappiness, a little girl walking through her First Nation at home. All the furniture has been sold to fuel Oxycontin purchases. There's no food to eat because food money has all gone to buy drugs. She's hungry. She walks by a neighbor's house. Family are sitting down to dinner, and she wishes that she was a member of that family. That's the type of so many of the stories and poems that have been seen, that I've seen. There is a major crisis in many of these communities. And when I was working, I still continue to go up. The Lieutenant Governor, the one that just retired, I went with his wife because he wasn't able to travel, and so I kept in touch with the communities. And what I saw was more and more drug use, more and more introduction of gangs. At the same time, on my little side, Frontier College reports that the kids are retaining far more of what they're learning in school by going to these summer reading camps. So we're doing some good there. But that's not going to solve the problems. There has to be a change in the attitude of Canadians. Because until there's a change in the attitude of Canadians, positive change, government's not going to do anything because they're not going to get any votes for that. And maybe not around here, but in Western Canada, there's huge, huge problems of racism against Native people. And so you're not going to get votes out there. And if you're not going to get votes, why do anything? And so that's why I write my little novels and try to get people to look at it from the inside.
A question in the back.
I have 2 questions. First one I'll ask publicly, the second one I'd like to talk to you afterwards. What might your thoughts be on like two major problems, as I see it, with especially First Nations, Indian people, especially to say in Ontario, are education and healthcare. Those are both provincially mandated. Do you think that the Indian Act and maybe some of these things should be under provincial legislation or under provincial jurisdiction, still allowing, like with transfer payments or whatever, through the federal government? But in other words, I guess, do you think there should be some restructuring of the Indian Act and maybe some of the major problems like healthcare and education maybe under more local government, administration, or where it's closer to the people?
That makes sense on a logical level. Because the expertise, you hear me all right? Because the expertise is, in terms of education, it's all provincial level. The federal government is not in the business of running elementary and secondary schools. So they don't do anything to the local communities, and they don't know how to run them either. And, but I don't see it ever happening that the chiefs, the communities, would let their federal government off the hook, in the sense that their treaties are with the federal government. And some treaties that provincial governments sign them off, they're with the federal government. And that will never happen.
Well, if you don't need a mic, I don't need one either.
I can have my great.
Oh, you do? No, I think that's for the filming.
No.
Okay.
Actually, I found this very interesting. I'm a teacher, and I work both at Standing Stone and the River, which are the 2 reserves outside London, and 2 of them anyway. And originally, I'm from South Africa, so the thing you were referring to about Tutu was I knew about that already. What I was wondering, when you're working at those schools, yes, the reconciliation thing from Harvard they actually broadcasted it through the school so everyone could hear. And obviously the actual Native teachers and everybody, they were crying and they were but the children had no idea really what was going on. And for me, I saw mostly that, okay, the break in the culture because of the residential schools and the impact of that is the greatest, the worst thing that happened, I would say, because it's taken the culture, the language, and it's made that huge disconnect between the child and the parent. But as you educate, okay, if you bring the culture back, which is what they're doing, you are also alienating them from the mainstream, I'll say, white culture. So how can you bring those 2 worlds together? Because that's what I see the biggest problem, especially for the Native youth. They get very lost. So that's where you lose them. So I wonder what you think about how you can bring these 2 worlds together, because they are so far apart. But
Yes.
they need, what do you think?
In fact, I don't think that there's anything incompatible about promoting and encouraging Native people to reconnect with their roots and being Canadians, because that's what all the other groups in society. Scottish dancers,
Yeah, exactly.
Ukrainian Easter eggs, or and whatever, and retaining your rich culture and being a Canadian. I mean, I'm sure there's South Africa you could have barbecues.
Right, yeah.
And not be alienated from your society.
Yeah, but I kind of feel like the government, you know, I don't have that much respect for government, most governments, but I think that it's reconciliation, it's not dealing with the heart, because that's what was broken, and that's why it's so difficult, and that's what needs to be healed for things to come forward. Because I still see that broken, because you see the families are not supported enough, so they pass on their frustration there to the children, and
Yeah,
that's the greatest impact on the children.
I don't see that there's any reconciliation.
No,
has
I
occurred.
don't at all. It's
But
just
I guess it has other instruments. I mean, I was in South Africa during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission
Okay.
meetings, but there it served a different purpose, because they were reconciling vicious actions by the white security forces, slaughter of people, torture, and killing of community leaders. And unless they found some way of dealing with that, the country would never move ahead. So that was a number one, virtually, national priority. And so they brought these killers in, and they confronted the people, the families, and then they told what had really happened. And sometimes they said they were sorry, sometimes they didn't. But they brought them together to have a catharsis so that they could get on and lead their lives. Here, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they never brought the nuns and the priests and the United Church ministers and the teachers who had raped and done all these things for 100 years. They never came to face the kids.
They shouldn't have used that word, reconciliation.
I think we have a comment at the back. Somebody wants to jump in here. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a European Canadian, and I've been a working artist all my life, since the age of 20. And so for 40 years, as First Nations people have regained their culture, I've learned from First Nations artists and writers and poets. And I have no problem understanding what they're talking about. And I think that's since when did Europeans invent culture? It's a joke. All peoples have culture and art and music, and I've benefited from this resurgence that's happened. But I don't see it as a problem that you're talking about at all.
I'm not saying it's a problem.
Well, what is it? They're not two worlds. We all live in.
If you meet these children, you would say it is.
Pardon?
Well,
I don't see it as a problem.
not.
No, I do a little truth and reconciliation here. They're both right.
Would you like to weigh in a little bit more on that, or do we have another question coming too?
No.
Okay. Yeah.
I think I was going to ask something similar, but in terms of an integrated model versus an authentic representation of the culture. And I guess I'll refer to Malcolm X in criticizing kind of integration as eventually being assimilation. So I thought that's kind of what she asked.
I think that in Canada, maybe up till the events on Parliament Hill, when there was everybody had a rude awakening to what was happening among many disaffected youth in the country, there was always the presumption that cultures could learn from each other, and that you can, and the stronger your roots were, the more self-confident you were, the more you're able to participate in mainstream society. you had to buy into a certain set of principles, democracy, respect for others, and all the rest of it. But beyond that, you know, you can be linked to your culture as much as possible, and you can learn from other cultures. Among the native world, there were many, many nations in Canada and the United States with distinctive cultures. There were some common factors, but there were tremendous differences. And what we have seen over the past 50 years is that there has been a sort of pan-cultural movement. That, for example, powwows, you integrated the big drum of the Sioux with the jingle dancing of the Ojibways. You have the certain war songs from the West together with other types of music from from woodland people. You have the people being proud of West Coast art and everybody feeling native. And so that has happened among the native world, and that has been happening as well among the various ethnic communities that make up the non-native world. And I guess, however, there are frictions as a result of that. That some people feel that, you know, they're in their culture, the role of women was different, and there was things like that, and they rebelled against it. And I think that has led to disaffected youth looking for a cause somewhere. That is sort of one of the byproducts of that. But I hope that we can continue with what we have been doing, and that is learning from each other, not becoming a melting pot, but keeping our culture. For example, myself, when my mother married a white man when she was 14. When she got married, she was kicked off the reserve, because if you married a white man, you lost your status. And so we were neither Indian nor white when we grew up. We were, in the village, when they were mad at us, for dirty Indians, or dirty half-breeds, or something like that. And so I guess I always was very careful, because I was an outsider in the village. And one of the reasons I joined the Foreign Service, I think, was that I could be a Canadian, an unhyphenated Canadian. I could represent Canada. I could be an ambassador for Canada. I didn't wear my identity, ethnic identity, on my sleeve, but I defended it when I had to. But I really felt that I belonged when the government changed the law about Native women and their status. My mother got her status back in 1985. All the kids we all got our status back. We were able to go and visit our relatives on the Ram Reserve, because, you know, as one of them. And they welcomed us there. Well, we didn't going back, but we couldn't stay overnight and all that sort of stuff. And so I think I've been a much more fulfilled person since I'm able to identify myself with the people of the Rama First Nation. So ended the sermon.
We have another question in the middle here.
Yeah, thank you for your compelling talk. I'm just wondering, basically, like, why literature?
Pardon me?
I'm just wondering, like, why literature? Why do you think literature? What's your investment in literature? It seems like almost an intrinsic personal investment. Like, okay, so you get this narrative about the northern communities, and you do an enormous book drive, and then the suicide rate does not increase. You know, and so what's the end of that story? And why do you turn personally to writing fiction and writing literature as your response at the, you know, why literature?
why literature? I think that when you read a novel, in my opinion, you enter into the minds of the characters. The characters may not have anything to do with you. They're the ones that you have created, but you've also created a movie. And as you're reading that book, you are absorbed in the world of the characters. And you're able to see that these, if you cut them, they bleed. You're able to cut through the stereotypes, and you get a better understanding of the way they feel. And if you get a better understanding of the way they feel, then you are going to treat them in a different way or look at them in a different way. So I think literature has played that role, especially novels over the past 100 years, has played that role in all societies. That is, even books which are not overtly serving social justice purposes, they expand your awareness of your common humanity. And so novels play that role. I speak as a great expert. I haven't written now for about 6 years, but I've always felt that. And in terms of, yes, suicide levels have not gone down. On the other hand, I think that we have made progress in the sense of they would have been worse if the kids weren't being exposed to the summer reading camps. And I've been told, my daughter was a doctor in one of these remote communities, so she's been telling me, that the kids are, even though they're what the work they submit to me, or to the progress, or to the committee looking at their efforts, that there is a group of young people in every community which is more self-confident and which is now going on to university where it was unheard of before. And so, and besides, I'm just Jim Bartleman. I am just one of many people. But if we had a whole pile of us all working, trying to build bridges between the communities and work on the things which are really important, I think literature is really important. Literacy is really important. And I'm really happy that Frontier College, now 86 communities across Canada, Northwest Territories adopted it, they paid for it, the kids to come. And I came up with this model. The model was $33,000 for a camp of 25 kids for 3 weeks. Because in the pilots I ran, the pilots that with the Scouts and YMCA, they were charging $300,000 per camp. So I went up and came up with this model. It has to have involvement in the community. It has to the community has to provide them with places to stay, teachers and all the rest of it. The elders have to come in and talk as well. That's a model that is working. And so I'm very proud of that.
I want to ask a follow-up.
Sorry?
It's kind of a follow-up.
Yeah, sure.
Just about identity.
Pardon me?
Identity.
Yes?
Because I've had questions of my own identity. I'm born and raised in Canada. My parents are from the Middle East. I consider myself a Muslim Arab, but at the same time, I'm very detached from. I couldn't go to Syria now, obviously, to live in Syria. I don't have any really paper trail of Syria, and so it makes me think about what Canada is as an identity. And when I see Aboriginal groups and tribes kind of disassociating themselves from a Canadian identity that comes from a colonial past, I begin to think about colonization and that history. My question is, how real is that in the Indigenous community? About kind of, I've heard some people find it offensive even to consider themselves Canadian. Where did this word come from? Who imprinted it on us? So, and they're kind of holding on to their tribal affiliations.
I think the relationship of Native people to the Canadian government and mainstream Canada is different than the relationship of the groups that have come afterwards, for example, from the Middle East to the Canadian government. The groups that came afterwards came swearing an oath of allegiance, and that they would accept the general principles, democratic principles, way of life, and all the rest of it. They're buying into something. Whereas the Native people say, we were here first. We are a separate founding nation of the country, whether it's true or not. And therefore, and this has been recognized in the treaties. And so therefore the treaties are extremely important. But, in my view, and I can only talk about my experience, Native people I know are proud Canadians. One of my ancestors, two of my ancestors fought in the War of 1812 against the nasty Americans. I have relatives who fought in the First World War, in the Second World War, and they're heroes in the community. And so it's a risky thing to say, your attachment to Canada, but I've always been attached to Canada. People I know have always been attached to Canada. See its warts and try to correct them, build bridges, that's all. I think in a way it's more difficult for Arab Muslims in the sense that I guess the identity is tied up with the religion to some extent. And a lot of young people are not interested in the values of mainstream Canadian society. See, that are ruling their intrinsic identity. But I can't. You could speak to that. I couldn't speak to that.
I actually, on the contrary, find that more affiliated with Canada, but in terms of like the kind of authentic, whatever it is, but I don't even know what it is, culture. It just doesn't seem like it's there.
In Canada.
Yeah, like in terms of like, how do they, if they're Arab or, what do they identify with, right? So.
I guess that's one of the things that the monarchy was so important. That it was something that people could rally behind, and no matter what your political affiliation. And that remains very important to the Native people, the ones I know. Certainly the ones in Northern Ontario. And the members of the royal family, when they come, they always go up to these communities. When I received them at Queen's Park, and the chiefs were always very happy to see them because the treaties were signed in the name of either the king or queen, depending on when that occurred. So they are monarchists, probably more monarchists among the Native community than there are in this room. So that is something which unites them. But everybody here would have a different opinion upon what is a real Canadian. I think a real Canadian is someone who is proud of their particular roots and of being Canadian as a whole as well.
Don't forget hilarious and good looking, because that's how I like to differentiate. I think Canada Reads this year, Joseph Boyden's book, The Oneida, was well defended by another popular Indigenous celebrity, Wapikanu, and what he talked about is dividing Indigenous literature from politics. Can it be done? Is it done? In the Academy, we talk about it all the time, but I think that Ms. Bartleman, you represent that very, collision. Politics and Indigenous literature coming together at the same time. So I'd like to thank you.
Social justice.
Social justice. Thank you. I like it.
National
Sorry.
holidays, yeah.
But I'd like to thank you for speaking.